Hey, what is going on guys? Welcome to RB Hardware. In today's video we're gonna check out a 27-inch 4K monitor that only costs a bit over $200, which makes it very interesting because 4K monitors are usually selling for a lot more. Now there is a but here, and that is that this Philips screen is unfortunately only 60 Hz. Now usually I don't recommend picking up a monitor below at least 120 Hz if your goal is to use it for gaming, but considering how much you have to spend on a gaming PC in order to reach an average of 144 FPS at 4K, I figured maybe 60 Hz isn't that bad after all. Maybe this budget monitor can actually be worth it for anyone, you know, that prefers higher detail over, let's say, high FPS count. So on paper this monitor has a lot of potential given what it costs you. Let's start with the specifications. So the Philips 276E8VJSB is part of Philips E-series lineup. It's got a 27-inch 60Hz IPS 4K screen that supports 10 bits per sub-pixel and has a 5 millisecond gray to gray response, which honestly you shouldn't put too much trust in, and we're gonna touch on response time in just a second. It turns out it's actually very good. Anyway, it's got an MSRP of under $300, but it usually sits around $220 to $240 on Amazon, which is one of the reasons it caught my attention. Now at any point during the video feel free to check out the links to where you can pick this up down below. And once you get the monitor packed out of the box and set up, you'll notice that it's got a black finish and a sort of a modern look to it, with small bezels and a pretty minimalistic stand made of steel that's got a wide enough footprint, you know, to not make the monitor feel wobbly. Now unfortunately, as for most budget friendly screens out there, they tend to have a very basic stand coming with it, and there is no exception here. You do have 5 to 20 degree tilting, but yeah, that's about it. The biggest shame here is probably the fact that there is no VESA mounting on the back, so you're gonna have to live with the stand as it is. But this is usually the case when looking at a budget-friendly monitor. For connections on the back, there are two HDMI 2.0 as well as a single DisplayPort 1.2 and a 3.5mm audio output. The HDMI as well as the single DisplayPort allow you to run the monitor in its native 4K 60Hz resolution with 10-bit color, and an HDMI cable comes included. Now let's talk about first impressions very quickly guys, because out of the box the colors look amazing without doing anything, and having it standing next to a TN panel display, it is pretty obvious which one's got the superior colors, and I kind of have a wow moment once I had it plugged in. And one thing I noticed is how much brighter this one feels in comparison to my other typical gaming monitors. It's got a 350 peak brightness, so it is nothing, you know, exceptional, but the punchiness from the colors as well as the high contrast makes everything just look more alive. Viewing angles are also very good as well, and here I'm demonstrating using the logom.nl color viewing angle test, and as we can see, unless we're getting, you know, way out of the sides, there is little to no color shifting, which is very awesome to see, and it is something that IPS displays are very known at being good at. Now having a quick look at the boring OSD, there's not a whole lot to play around with. You got the basic stuff here, such as, you know, predefined profiles. You guys have seen this plenty of times before, there's not a lot to talk about here. The joystick is a nice touch and it makes navigating seem so much easier than having to rely on buttons. Now having in mind that this is an IPS display, we generally expect to see great colors and viewing angles. This is typically where IPS excels. As for backlight bleed, there is some visible clouding and a bit of edge bleed on my particular unit. I'm not sure if the camera is able to pick it up, but it is barely visible. But generally guys, after 1 week I've spent with this monitor, the clouding and edge bleed hasn't bothered me one single bit. And one cool thing about this monitor is that it's considered flicker free, and this means that unlike many other monitors who use something called PWM or pulse width modulation to regulate the backlight brightness, this monitor instead uses something called DC or direct current, which means that there won't be any flickers. Let's touch on responsiveness and input lag. Now I don't have the necessary measurements to analyze the latency, but thanks to PCmonitors.info's responsiveness responsiveness test of the monitor, they calculated a 2.79 millisecond input lag. And to be honest, while I was a bit worried that this was gonna be a problem on the screen, I'm happy to report that I have been enjoying hours of gaming without ever noticing any delay or input lag, any noticeable smearing or ghosting effects. It should be said though, I did notice a moderate degree of blur in Doom for example, but this is more linked to the 60 FPS refresh rate and not really the screen itself. But let's talk about the big selling argument of the screen, the 4K Ultra HD experience. 4K on 27-inch gives us a pixel density of 163 ppi or pixels per inch, which makes everything look super tiny even if you're sitting fairly close to the screen. While it is possible to watch YouTube and even watching movies and play games, reading text is a hassle, and therefore I do recommend having at least a 125% scaling or a 150% scaling activated in Windows, which make things look a whole lot better. And while scaling makes things more readable, it doesn't change the fact that everything just looks so much more crisp and alive on this screen compared to any 1080p monitor. And once I activated 4K for the first time, this was a wow moment, and I realized how much better games can look once you increase the number of available pixels on the screen. Now, something to have in mind guys, as we're increasing the resolution, is that it puts a whole lot more strain on your system and in particular your graphics card. For most of the testing I've been using a GTX 1660 Ti with 6 gigs of VRAM. For example, all the games such as Halo, Master Chief Collection and WoW Classic for example runs great at 60 FPS with VSync activated. But then you have these more intense games such as Gears 5 or Red Dead Redemption for example, where 4K simply is way too much for the GPU to handle. In those cases I recommend dropping the resolution to 1440p or perhaps even 1080. And one cool thing here is that the monitor is able to use an interpolation or a scaling process, and it's able to map low resolutions into these old 4K pixels basically. And for this to work you need to make sure that the monitor handles the scaling and not the graphics card. If you're sitting on a graphics card from AMD, this should be handled by the monitor by default, but if you're using Nvidia you might have to check that there is no scaling activated for this to work. When activated there is some degree of image softening visible if you look very carefully, but it's definitely not something that you will notice unless nobody told you about it. And overall, although lack of VESA mounting support and a pretty lame stand are things I wish we could have avoided, I am still extremely happy with my new 4K display. And you have to remember, this is a 4K screen under $300. You usually find this on Amazon at $240, which is crazy affordable with all things considered. Obviously a faster display would have been nice, but at the same time they would have made it much more expensive, and considering how much money you have to spend on a graphics card to actually reach 120 or 144 FPS in game, that can make it the deal breaker for many people. And this monitor gives you that sweet middle ground. It lets you play at 4K at 60 FPS, and if your PC isn't powerful enough to meet that in all games, you have the option of dropping the resolution a bit without having to worry about soft image as a result. Obviously this screen also works great on any console user, for example Xbox One X and PS4 Pro, and even upcoming Series X and PS5 will run great on this as well. If you're one of those that knows that you're gonna play a ton of Valorant, CSGO or Fortnite, you definitely want to look elsewhere. But if you want to play a lot of AAA games and 60 FPS is fine, this monitor is definitely a brilliant option. Links to where you can pick this up can be found down below. Now if you like this review, please give this video a big thumbs up and let me know what other monitors you would like to see coming up next.